Good evening, I'm Mike Baldwin and welcome to the launch of my book, Harp Making in Late-Georgian London. I'm getting some feedback. Thank you for joining me tonight and for showing an interest in my book. During the launch, I will talk a little bit about how the book came to be written, and I will read some excerpts. We're very lucky to have two musical performances, specially recorded by Dr. Maria Christina Cleary, and I want to thank her and David Monti in advance for their generosity and thoughtfulness in preparing these. Towards the end of tonight's launch, there will be an opportunity to ask questions and raise points of interest. You'll be able to do this through YouTube live chat if you're logged in to YouTube, or you can log in with a Google account. If you do not have access, you're very welcome to email questions to me, and I'll put my email on screen. There we are. The email will be open throughout the evening, and I'll pick up any questions that arise at the end. I've been aware of the need for a book on London harp makers for many years. While studying for my degree during the early 1990s, I researched their patent registrations and wrote a dissertation on the subject. After graduating, I worked at Pilgrim Harps for a short time, before leaving the harp world behind, or so I thought. On a Friday evening in 2007, after rediscovering my dissertation in a box, I began wondering what other information was out there. The National Archives here in the UK had recently published an online catalogue, and so I went searching. At first, it seemed that I'd not find anything. There were a few references to insurance documents, but not much besides. It struck me as strange that such a significant industry left so little behind. After a moment of inspiration, or possibly more like frustration, I changed how I was looking, entering the term harp maker into the name field of the search engine. Immediately, a reference to a Mr. Harp Maker appeared, together with the date 21st of February 1821. Now, I have a good memory for useless facts, and I recalled that this date coincided with the death of the harp maker Jacob Erax. So, the following morning I drove the short distance to the National Archives in southwest London, called up the documents, and found that my supposition was indeed correct. And the breadth of information contained in these documents was just wonderful. I decided to write a book based on these new sources, but didn't know when to start. A short time later, Mike Parker, a fellow researcher, and I met Lewis Jones, my degree supervisor, for coffee. A short conversation led to Lewis supervising my MA, an initial examination of the Erax materials, and my PhD, which expanded earlier work to include existing and newly discovered sources, which illuminated my understanding of the London makers. And so, over a period of 10 years, a book was born. This is the story of harp making in Late-Georgian London. It begins a century after the invention of the pedal harp. It is the biography of an instrument born in the Baroque era, developed in the classical, and popularised in the Romantic. First and foremost, it's a tale of innovation and transformation by European-born inventors and musical instrument makers, situated in London, the vibrant and rapidly growing capital of the world. Change, as is so often the case, has many agents. Whilst the French Revolution and subsequent Anglo-French wars played a significant part in the birth of this English-made instrument, the economic, political and industrial developments, which would lead to London becoming the centre of harp making and consumption, began over 100 years earlier. These new harps were undoubtedly a product of musical development, but also, as we will see, of industrial, political and cultural revolution. In France, Sébastien Érard, a Strasbourg-born pianoforte maker, had been working to improve the harp since 1788. Fleeing the French Revolution and relocating from Paris to 18 Great Marlborough Street, London in 1792, he continued to innovate. It was Érard's 1794 patent and fourchette action that gave rise to the pedal harp's English Golden Age. Over the next 50 years, around 20 London makers would supply Britain, her empire, and the New World with harps. 23 patents 9 registered by Sebastian and his nephew Pierre, would see innovation drive competition. Although impossible to calculate precisely, serial numbers on surviving instruments suggest that around 22,000 harps, more than 6,000 by Erard alone, were made in London during the 19th century. Until recently, Erard has dominated discourse on the 19th century harp. Sebastian and Pierre Erard were undoubtedly instrumental in its development, and while they were the most successful and prolific makers in terms of sales, a monocular focus has largely ignored the vibrant, substantial, and interwoven thriving community of makers and inventors. This book draws upon a broad range of primary sources, including financial accounts, diaries, inventories, letters, maps, property leases and plans, trade directories, wills, newspapers, and instruments to tell the story of harp making in Late-Georgian London. It is not just the story of the Erards, but also of their contemporaries. By the beginning of the 19th century, the harp had become a fashionable, desirable, and somewhat feminine object. The ability to play advertised female refinement and skill. In an inquiry into the best system of female education, Chirrell writes, almost all the daughters of manufacturers, tradesmen, farmers learned to dance, to sing, and to play on the pianoforte. Musical accomplishment, as espoused in educational preceptors and fiction, enhanced a woman's marriageability. The schoolmaster in La Fontaine's Edward and Annette persuades her parents that Annette ought to take lessons on the harp. Annette will surely never be the wife of a peasant. When writing Mansfield Park, Jane Austen may have had romance in mind. Edmund attended the parsonage daily in order to be indulged with his favourite instrument, the harp, but also to see Miss Crawford. It was perhaps the form and lines of the harp and its relationship to the player that rendered it distinctly female. Moody suggests that Mary Crawford's playing on the harp conjures erotic imagery, and that Edmund is attracted to this sensual image of her. Writing a year before Austen's novel, a correspondent described only as a lady of distinction confirms this perception, admonishing women who, when playing their harp, twist themselves into so many contortions and writhe their bodies and faces about into such actions and grimaces. Their bosoms heave, their shoulders shrug, their heads swing to the right and left, their lips quiver, their eyes roll, they sigh, they pant. Were it possible for these conceit-intoxicated warblers, these languishing dolls, to guess what rational spectators say of their follies, they would be ready to break their instruments and be done forever. Ironically, she then praises the harp as a visual adjunct to the female form. At this point, we're going to have our first interlude. Dr. Maria Christina Cleary will play Robin Adair, a short piece by Anne-Marie Krumpholz. Its inclusion at this point is aimed to demonstrate music of this period, played on a rare Erax single-action harp with ring stops. Maria's technique, you will observe, has nothing to do with that described by Our Lady of Distinction. Right, I seem to have lost volume on this, so give me just a moment and I will see if I can fix that.
Apologies about some of the sound there. Some of the sound there.
Apologies
about apologies about apologies sound there. Apologies about.
Right, I think that's now working. Sorry about the sound. I'm running two laptops simultaneously, and software that I'm not particularly familiar with, so that I can run videos and PowerPoint simultaneously as well. We're going to move on now, so I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you. During the first half of the 19th century, makers initially established workshops in and around Soho and later centred in Fitzrovia and Marylebone. Aggregating close to suppliers and customers, location was clearly important. In London, there's a long tradition of like trades clustering in an area, such as clockmaking in Clerkenwell, silk weaving in Spitalfields, and furniture making on Tottenham Court Road. A map of harp makers, as you can see here on screen, shows that they were within walking distance of one another. Naturally, such proximity resulted in the movement of labour between makers and competition and sometimes cooperation. Now, if you have a look at the map, the first generation of makers, because really they came in three waves, are the yellow dots. The furthest away is 44 Great Portland Street, which is to the left of the picture, which is where Stumpf was. But even so, they were well within a mile of each other. To these, we can then add the blue dots, which is the second generation, and then the red dots. Oh, hang on, no, I've got this wrong, haven't I? So we start with the red dots, then we go to the blue dots, then we go to the yellow dots. Ignore what I'm saying. Harp makers' human stories are as interesting as their business lives. Records show that Joseph Beesmore, initially a gunsmith and later mechanism maker for Erat, before opening his own workshop, had a run-in with the law after mistakenly giving a streetwalker a sovereign. He'd intended to pay her a shilling. Now, let's see if this works. There we are. Alexander Blasdell, another Erat alumni, who gifted a harp to the Princess Royal at Windsor Castle on her 3rd birthday, found himself in debtor's prison following a business disagreement with Frederick Chatterton, the renowned harpist and composer. James Delvaux, a Belgian, was much esteemed at Erard, where he was foreman. After leaving, he formed a business with John Fussbrown. After only 3 years, the latter moved to New York, establishing what would become Brown and Buckwell. He initially maintained a transatlantic relationship with Delvaux. Francois-Joseph Dizzy, another Belgian, arriving in London aged only 16 after allegedly falling off of his ship and nearly drowning and losing his possessions, quickly became established as a harpist, teacher and later composer. He scandalised society when he fell for his married student, Margaret Anne Bazette. After Margaret's husband sought an Act of Parliament permitting their divorce, Dizzy married her, and the pair set up home at Crabtree, Fulham, next door to Queen Caroline, herself estranged from George IV. Dizzy later worked with his best man, Charles Grohl, the originator of the double-action harp with 2 rows of fourchettes, to design, patent and make his perpendicular harp. And there's 2 harps here in the picture. The first one is the V&A, the second one at Musée de la Musique in Paris. The first one was made under the Dizzy name alone, the second one by Dodd. At this time, by about 1820, Dodd had purchased Dizzy's patent and the rights to make his instruments. As we will see, that did go slightly wrong. The Dodd Company grew from the famous bow makers of the same name. Founded by Thomas Dodd, who on his 1834 death left over 50,000 in his will, harp making was developed by his son, Edward, who made similar instruments to Erard and later bought the rights to Dizzy's harps. By 1838, Edward was bankrupt. In 1843, visiting his son on board a ship where he was preparing to travel to Australia, he fell from the gangplank into the Thames. Despite attempts to save him, Edward drowned, leaving his family in penury. As their letters tell us, the Erards were not immune to financial difficulties. Set up to inoculate the firm from risks posed by the 1789 French Revolution and subsequent Republic, the London branch bailed out the French company when it ran out of money, causing cash flow difficulties in London. Pierre Erard borrowed money where possible and was keen to use Sebastian's collection of old master paintings to refinance the business and renovate their 18 Great Marlborough Street premises, which were, by 1815, in a parlour state. The business temporarily relocated to Wigmore Street, and Pierre moved the paintings there as he feared the outbreak of fire. However, challenges with workforce posed an unexpected risk when a magnificent Rubens was vandalised, supposedly by Schnoss, a fired employee, who allegedly made a 3-foot-long cut into the surface of the canvas with a knife. Only 2 weeks later, Pierre discovered the theft of 28 small paintings, worth £2,000. Again, his workforce was blamed. Mary Cranby, the daughter of Erard's doorman, took the pieces, pawning one worth £1,000 for £10. The perpetrators were caught, the artworks recovered, and Mary Cranby spent the next year in prison. Our knowledge of the Erax company results from the discovery of their company ledger, cash book, property leases and wills. The ledger, although limited to just 41 months from February 1821 to June 1824, records the full breadth of company records, identifying not only customers and their purchases, but also wages, supplier accounts, adaptations to their new premises at 23 Berners Street, and also family expenditure. The cash book covers 6 years, noting daily purchases of disposable materials, such as pigment and gold leaf, and the leases describe various properties. Compiled following Jacob Erax's 1821 death, they show a family business in transition. Erax executors, Martha, his wife, and a local harp teacher, George Sharp, steered the company until Jacob Jr.'s 25th birthday, when he and his brother James succeeded to the business. A third executor, John Broadwood, the pianoforte maker, who predeceased Jacob Sr., was named in the will but not replaced. Over subsequent years, other Erax siblings also worked in and around the business. Julia Erax acted as an administrator with Julia Viepert, and the two formed a lifelong, possibly same-sex relationship, living together for over 60 years. And William Erax, a music teacher and composer, shared the treasuryship of the Society of British Musicians with his elder brothers. Only 2 pieces of music by William Erax survive. They were written very much from a teacher's perspective and were probably used by his students. And here we stop again. Maria has recorded one of these pieces, The Bluebells of Scotland, a popular tune of the day, arranged by William Erax. I just want to say thank you very much to Maria and David for recording those wonderful pieces. I owe you two dinner next time we catch up. Frederick Grosjean, originally from Switzerland, formed a short partnership with John Charles Schweitzer, a native of Hanover. Pierre, writing to Sebastian, reveals that after he'd fired Schweitzer in 1819, he went to work for Dodd. Grosjean and Schweitzer's enterprise ended with bankruptcy in 1824, but both continued making. Schweitzer initially moved to Regent Street with a new partner, Emmanuel Serquet. By 1831, he was again bankrupt and residing in the Fleet Prison. Although he recovered and continued harp making, he died in 1846, a pauper, in St Pancras Workhouse. Grosjean and Serquet fared better, and a price list dating from around 1838 reveals the full range of instruments and accessories made. I'm going to pull this up onto the PowerPoint for you. Now, not only were single actions still very much en vogue and being made at this time, the range of colours here is really interesting. The number of instruments, we do have a Gothic harp in imitation of Erard, but we also have a Swiss harp which had slightly different decoration. We have a harp à la Jean Lee, which is a small harp. In fact, I have one here behind me. I'll pick it up later and show you, which originally had been thought up by Madame de Genlis as a training tool for harpists in their carriages, and lots more besides. According to John Broadwood, the pianoforte maker, writing in 1803, Johann Andreas Stumpf made the best quality harps. Stumpf, a Beethovenophile, sold his Henry Street premises to Broadwood in 1812, moving to Great Portland Street. On his death in 1847, amongst many harp and pianoforte parts, an auction of his effects included 13 pieces by Mozart in the composer's hand, 6 leaves of autographed music by Beethoven, a locket containing Beethoven's hair, and initials worked in that of Wolfgang and Constance Mozart. From 4 patriarchs, Erard, Erax, Dodd and Stumpf, grew at least 17 other businesses. The web of relationships between each is inevitably more complex than it initially appears, and it is likely that not only movement between makers was more common than depicted, but that some small makers are yet to be identified. There are numerous other makers that we do not have the time to cover tonight. They are all covered in the book, and documentary analysis, however, enables us to estimate the number of instruments made. I put the number of instruments made around 22,000 during the 19th century. This is based on surviving harps and their serial numbers, but also on a survey of the Morley documents. The Morley ledgers, of which there are 39, range from 1891 through to around 1845, give or take. And they record the restoration of many instruments, giving us the numbers, but also names of makers that perhaps are now forgotten. The design of the early 19th century harp, like that of contemporary furniture, was heavily influenced by archaeological discovery and architectural revival. 3 models, each invented by Erard and heavily plagiarised by other London makers, set both mechanical and decorative trends. Erard's single-action harp, sometimes today called the Empire, was inspired by the classical revival. His double action, now widely called Grecian by the Grecian movement, that was, according to Smith, an outgrowth of the dominant facet of the Regency, which developed from archaeological prototypes published by Charles Heathcote Tatton in 1799 and Thomas Hope in 1807. The terms Empire and Grecian, given by analogy to the Gothic, were not commonly used in relation to the harp during the early decades of the 19th century. Those who bought harps would have expected them to complement their domestic environments. As the Adam brothers had linked architecture with interiors, Ackerman and Pugin acknowledged that furniture and indeed musical instruments should reflect the style of the spaces in which they were placed. Erard, therefore, in choosing first classical revival and later Gothic decoration, was mirroring contemporary trends by positioning the harp amongst the finest furniture of the day. Erard's first 55 Grecian harps were ornamented by George Jackson, a composition ornament and frame maker. Whether Jackson designed the ornaments, supplied them from stock, or worked to Erard's designs is unknown. Jackson also supplied composition ornaments to Alexander Barry and Thomas Dodd. The adoption of classical revival style in favour of Rococo decoration applied to French harps was due to its widening and fashionable use in British and French design. And Sebastian Erard, having been denounced by the French revolutionary authorities, perhaps wished to associate himself with the new aesthetics of revolutionary France. Similarly, the originator of Erard's overall decorative schemes are unknown, although their designs, as you can see some of them on screen now, do survive. Whilst it's Erard's instruments that are most identifiable, other makers design their own models in an attempt to differentiate themselves. Harp making became a lucrative business, one in which makers were prepared to risk failure. Patents registered between 1794 and 1845 described three schools of innovation: those concerned with the improvement of the semitone mechanism, those that addressed perceived structural weaknesses, and those that sought to improve tone or tuning or enable the playing of new musical effects. Makers carefully monitored each other's innovations and sometimes attempted to stop them. In a letter to Sebastian Erard on the 11th of November 1814, Pierre recounts his visit to view Edward Dodd's and Francois-Joseph Dizzy's new harp. Visiting with pretended anonymity, with the purported intention of seeking a harp for his sister, he tried to ascertain information about the harp. I plan to buy a double-action harp for my sister. I am Parisian, and my sister writes to me from Paris that Monsieur Erard's harps have just come out, and that the Institute has given them a very favourable report. Before I buy one, I would very much like to see the mechanism as well as that made by Monsieur Dizzy to compare the two. Is it not here where I can buy one of Monsieur Dizzy's harps? And Dodd responds, yes, sir, but they are not ready yet, and we don't know when they will be ready. Monsieur Sebastian Erard would never have made it his had it not been for his extreme fondness of inventions. Having been told by Dodd that he could only show the harp when his son, the maker, was there, Pierre returned later to find the harp partly strung and apparently unregulated. Demanding strings and a tuning key, he attempted to string it, but was told by Dodd the younger that 2 harps had been made and that the only tuning key was with Dizzy, who was away. That the Dodds did not recognise Pierre, the director of their biggest competitor, is perhaps surprising. Despite the concentration of numerous harp makers within a small area, and although the movement of workforce between them was common, Pierre was apparently unknown to them, though I do wonder whether they were kind of winding him up a bit. He must have thought that he could visit anonymously. To be discovered would surely have risked ridicule. Indeed, as their conversation was ending, a former Erard employee, now working for Dodd, passed by and recognised his previous employer. It was certainly Erard who set mechanical trends, though his nephew's claims that Sebastian was a mechanical genius is perhaps somewhat overstated. His 1810 patent, which today we know as the Grecian harp, was actually based on an 1807 patent by Charles Grohl. Sebastian bought the rights to the patent in order to prevent competition and to develop the double fourchette system himself. Erax's 1813 patent is particularly interesting, as it combined Erard's fourchette with Cousineau's béquille. In using the latter, Erax enabled easier adjustment and finer regulation. Willis's 1819 patent is also fascinating, designed as it was by a 19-year-old who was the illegitimate son of Robert Darling Willis, George III's physician, and developed with Erax support. Competition came to a head on the 24th of April 1822 when three makers, Erard, Dodd and Delval, registered consecutively numbered patents. Whether all three queued at the door of the patent office one cannot say. Erard's innovations were relatively minor. Dodd, however, sought to strengthen the harp neck, and Delval gave us the first extended soundboard. It was, of course, Pierre Erard's 1835 registration of the Gothic harp, which was the greatest advance. Some makers had increased the range of their instruments from 43 to 44 strings. Pierre, however, introduced a larger 46-string instrument which dominated the field for the next 50 years. In the book, the next two chapters mine the Erax papers, reconstructing family and business life and drawing parallels between them and other harp makers and craftspeople. Manufacturing businesses like that of the Erax were common in Late-Georgian London. In such companies, emphasis was placed on family life. Profit was often secondary. In France, the Cousineaus and Nademans dominated harp making from around 1760 until well into the 19th century. Harp making in London was all but monopolised by the Erards, and other harp makers such as the Harnacks and Holdernesses employed more than one generation. Other instrument companies were family concerns too. Burkat Shudi's daughter married his apprentice John Broadwood, resulting in the harpsichord making partnership that grew to become the Broadwood Piano Forte Making Company. Whilst the histories of some larger family-run companies have been written, smaller ones have been largely ignored. So in the absence of records from other harp companies, the Erax accounts offer a unique view into the juxtaposition between business and family affairs. Originally situated at 100 Wardour Street, a year before his death, Jacob Erax acquired a lease on 23 Berners Street, formerly the home of Sir Stamford Raffles, founder of Singapore. His Wardour Street premises had become overcrowded and dangerous. In his diary, Robert Willis noted a number of accidents and in doing so describes the layout of the building. In coming out of the factory, I slipped and fell from the top of the ladder to the bottom and down the next flight of steps onto the landing, so to come seated against the press with my legs up against the woodshop door. A dangerous and awkward fall, but I most providently escaped with a slight bruise on my elbow. Beesmore once fell down the same steps and over them onto the landing, but came on his feet unhurt, so got down before Hutton, who was descending before him. The pot girl fell down some time since, with 2 pots of beer in her hand, was very much hurt. Rose fell down them and came head foremost and hurt himself a little, and James Erax fell from the top against the woodshop door 3 weeks ago, all of which might have been prevented by a rope. Willis's record of the building work adds more detail. Without giving notice to the inhabitants, bricklayers began pulling down the chimney, sending a torrent of soot down into the rooms, which put Maunder's fire out, presumably at the top of the house on the 3rd floor, almost poisoned Draycott on the 2nd floor, covered the harps with soot in the showroom on the 1st floor, and Mrs. Erax's cloak and bonnet in the parlour on the ground floor, and spoilt the porter's dinner, which was preparing in the kitchen in the basement. Using such accounts in conjunction with leases, inventories, maps and photographs, it is possible to rediscover the layout of Erax workshops. In the book, chapters follow on harp making, materials and suppliers, and selling the harp. These describe the processes used by Erax men and their workforce, the instruments and accessories made, and services offered, these being typical of other London makers. The final chapter, Willis, Erax and the Harp, traces the prototyping of a new harp form in Jacob Erax manufacturing. I can't really understate how interesting Robert Willis's work was. Robert Willis, as I've already said, was the illegitimate son of George III's doctor. And for those who aren't aware of the history, that's Mad King George. He was very young, 18 when he patented his harp, 21 when it was being made, just before Erax's death. He was also something of an anti-monarchist, which I think is fascinating. Later, after Erax's death, the Erax's sons cancelled an offer to make the harp, and Willis went off and trained as a cleric. He later went on to become the Jacksonian Chair of Natural Philosophy at Cambridge University, where he counted amongst his friends Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace. And I love to think of the idea of the pedalling of the harp being an early form of computer programming, and that this perhaps influenced Babbage and Ada Lovelace in their work on the prototypes of the difference engine. Now, let's go back. That is all I think I'm going to read today from the book. The book is rather large. Those of you who've seen it will know. And not only does it contain, hopefully, some very interesting new information about the harp and its makers in Regency London, in Late-Georgian London, the appendices also make available huge amounts of information about Erax's workshops and what was going on in there, the kinds of harps he made and who he was providing harps for. There is a transcription of the Willis diary, but also photographs of the Erax, of the Erard composition ornaments and all the patents, and there's a lot to this. So I do hope you enjoy it. I'm going to open up the floor to questions, and I can see there's quite a lot of people have been posting whilst I've been rabbiting on. I'm also just going to log in and make sure that I haven't got anything on my email, so please do bear with me just a moment whilst I do that. Right. No, okay. So, if you have any questions that you would like me to answer, do please pop them into chat or email them to me. Failing that, I think that's probably the end. So it's a bit strange. I'm talking to a screen here and I can't see you and I can't hear you. It's not like a Zoom call at all. So do speak up now or forever hold your peace. And of course, if you do think of anything after we go offline, do feel free to email me. The book will be available from my website for the next month with a 20% discount. I'm just going to pull up the discount code for those of you who want. I've got a question coming in from Nancy Hurrell. Hi, Nancy. Can you speak to the prevalence of harp makers in this period who experience insolvency and bankruptcy? What do you attribute this to? Possibly the failure of aristocratic climates to pay their harp bills or the expense of materials. Nancy, yes, that certainly would have been part of it. And we do know that some people were very tardy at paying their bills if they paid them at all. I think it's more to do with the fact that the market became oversaturated. There were numerous bankruptcies. So Schweitzer went bankrupt, Dodd went bankrupt, Schweitzer went bankrupt two or three times. Blasdell also spent some time in prison. The Erax very nearly lost the shirt from their backs after Jacob died, and had to sell some of their properties in order to survive. I think this is mostly down to Erard's dominance. you if you read what John Broadwood said in 1803, he attributed the best quality instruments to Johann Andreas Stumpf, but acknowledged that Erards were by far the most fashionable. They had temporal advantage. They got there first. Also, in attempting to compete, some people threw a lot of money at things. Dodd paid a considerable sum to Dizzy. And I think that was probably the beginning of the end for him. The Dizzy Harp, as beautiful as it is, does have some issues. It's centrally strung, which makes it difficult to restring. Its neck is of iron. Doesn't make it a great deal heavier, believe it or not, than an Erard. But it was peculiar where people had become used to the normal Erard style. And it's interesting that those who did survive ditched their own personal models and really did go over to an Erard style. I hope that answers that question, Nancy, but we can talk more about that if you want to at some point. Now, Simon, what's my future plans? Well, COVID permitting, I am working on a reconstruction of an early Hochbrücker single action harp. It's based on the model. It's going to be a replica of the model that's in Musée de la Musique in Paris. Lewis Jones and I went over in November 2019 to measure it, and I have all the drawings and bits here, but haven't been able to get into the workshop to do anything, as my workshop's in a school and it's difficult to access due to COVID restrictions. So that is certainly happening. I have begun work looking a little bit more closely at Francois Joseph Dizzy. He was a fascinating character, and there is a possibility of developing that into a book which looks at harp players in Late-Georgian London, sort of, I guess, the sister book. Yeah, I think they're probably the two big projects that are going on, but I'm always tinkering away in archives when I can get to them, and certainly through online archives, looking for interesting things to see if I can, find out more, see if I can prove myself wrong on some of the things I've come up with, which is always fun. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question. Hazel Birch says, can you say something more, please, about harp making, about the harp making aspect? Absolutely. What do you want to know? There is a whole chapter on this. Interesting things. The Erax Inventory tells us all of the materials that they were using. It was recorded in 1824, not long before Jacob Jr.'s 25th birthday. And the inventory was done by Blasdell and Dodd. So two people who knew what they were talking about. So we can assume that what was written was probably quite accurate. We know that the main materials were really very much sycamore and maple, though they did use a certain amount of deal and things like that, mostly for string boxes, I would imagine. The harps were available in a very broad range of colours. If you think of it a bit like the modern, the car today, you could pretty much have a car in whatever colour, provided you're prepared to pay for it. The workshops were compartmentalised, that is, arranged in departments, so that you had your clean departments and your dirty departments separated. Most of the work was done in-house, though Erax used an external gilder called Mr. Brown. What else can I tell you about harp making? Oh, there's some wonderful information that came out of a Holtzapfel book. Jacob Erax Jr. married Anne Caroline Holtzapfel. Holtzapfel was a renowned tool maker, and you will still find his tools today, and his lathes and things were really, they were the first avant-garde. That's probably not the right word, but very futuristic at the time. And the family link continued after Jacob Jr.'s death in 1837. And it describes the Erax using clay from the deposits dug out from the Grand Union Canal, which was running through Camden, as part of the polishing process. for the harp, and you can just imagine them sort of like sneaking over a fence at night and picking up handfuls of the stuff. What can we say about harp makers? There's a lot in the book about processes, harp making, the processes that were used in harp making and how things were done. For instance, the body was formed around a caul, a sort of a conoidal shape, mould, if you like, and built over the top of that with veneers. The neck, we know, was laminated, and the harp columns were turned by a guy called Mr. Wakeling. I think they paid him something like £4 per column, and he was an external turner nearby. And of course, you've got all the decorative stuff, and you know, if people are interested, I'm quite happy. Just over here behind me, I've got the Erax composition moulds, so I can pull those out and show you those if they'd be of interest. So I hope that answers your question, Hazel. Let's have a look. Anything else? So Marilina, sorry, yeah, Marilina. I hope I've pronounced your Marilyn. I hope I've pronounced your name right. My glasses aren't great. I have a 19th century Grecian with wood small harp makers to the king on it. Have you heard of them? It's perfectly playable. I have heard of him. His name does appear in the Morley ledgers. I don't know anything about him, and I would be fascinated to see a photograph of the harp at some point if you wanted to share that with me. That would be wonderful. Yes, please pull out the moulds or whatever you mentioned earlier. So bear with me just a moment. I've had to move the living room around because there's so many harps and bits of stuff in here. I'm now going to go clambering over the top to get a few. Bear with me. Now, so what have I got here? There are about 80 pieces in the Morley Erard collection. So the first piece, I think those of you who have a Grecian will recognise this. It's one of a pair of mirrored angels playing lyres, and I think I've got 3 of those. It's very beautiful. It's quite heavy. It's made in gunmetal. And most of it is inlaid into sycamore or maple, though some of them, for example, this one, now this is my favourite. If Lewis Jones is watching, he'll be knowing exactly what's coming now. This is by Erax, and it is absolutely divine. It's a lion carved in boxwood and then sandwiched in sycamore so that it can be pressed without damaging or deforming it in too much. But that is by far my favourite, and it just so happens that I have the red harp behind me is an Erax, and I first saw this mould when I went to see Mike Parfit, and I just happened to say to him, you don't have a left-handed Erax lion, do you? And he pulled this out the box because I was missing a left-handed lion, so it was quite magical. There are, for those of you who know or own Gothics, you'll probably recognise this beauty from the capital of the harp. I don't know how well that comes up on the camera. I hope it comes up okay. And that's the bit that always gets broken off, that goes around the top of the niches at the top of the capital. As I say, there's loads more of these, and there's another generation of fantastic boxwood carved moulds here. So here is a Grecian caryatid, but this one, I don't know whether this is going to work. Can you see that? It's stamped J. Geo Morley, So it was made by the Morley firm by a man called Hall. Now I took these some while ago to see a frame maker at Tate Britain in London, and I showed him these and pulled. He went to the wall, a wall full of cabinets, drawers, and he pulled open a drawer, and it was full of moulds by the same maker that had been carved in order to restore the Turner collection. God knows when, but just beautiful things. What other questions do we have? Maria has a question. I was wondering, what is the reference to harps made by Longman and Clementi? There is a harp by Longman and Clementi in the book. Give me just a second and I will find it. Longman and Clementi were importing. Oh, this is probably again not going to work very well. I do have a better copy, Maria, so I can email that to you at some point. They were importing harps from France. Now, there seems to have been a transition period where I think maybe bits of harps were made in France and the woodwork was then done in London. And I say that because suddenly the style changed. So you had the crochet action, but around it you basically had an Erard clone sort of thing going on. And the style of it was distinctly London maker, so I wondered whether one of the London makers was doing that. How is Clay? Hazel can count 7 harps behind me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's others. This is my favourite at the moment. This is a Grosjean Harp à la Genlis. Now, I don't know how many were made, but you can maybe just make out the Grosjean name on the top there. I don't know. But this was for ladies in their carriages to keep their fingers exercised. And it's just ever so simple, but just very, very beautiful. The work, the decorative work on it is lovely. And there's also, if I can get there without tripping over, this little beauty. Oh, now this is an Erax child's harp, and I think we know who this was now made for. The date on the instrument, or the serial number on the instrument, coincides with a young player who I think, if I remember right, it was called Sophia Saunders. This was made in about 1826, 1827 and sold in 1830 when it appeared at auction. And it came to me after one of my colleague researchers, Jim Westbrook, went visiting a barn in, I think, Norfolk or Suffolk, and said to me, I saw this most remarkable harp, and I think it was by Erax. You'll have to go and look. So I went to look, and fortunately I was able to buy it. So it's got these tiny little pedals that are cranked. You still see these sometimes on modern instruments for small children, but it is just beautiful. Now, so how is clay used to polish? Well, it's once it's kind of refined and cleaned, you basically get left with a very fine grainy material. And once you've got 3 or 4 layers of polish, French polish over something, as long as the sort of grain of the clay, I can't remember what the word is now, come back to me after I go offline, it can be used to sort of rub in and just to polish to a very, very fine effect. It's really quite lovely. Right, so hang on. Gerrit van der Veer is asking something about strings. Did you find information about the use of wound strings in the early period around 1800? Well, not that early, no, but I did find some information about the price of strings, though that doesn't tell us much. Though Lewis Jones and I have been working on this, and bear with me. I have, where's it gone? We've got a couple of these. These are harp string boxes, some with their original strings still in place. We've yet to analyse these. Lewis Jones is the expert on strings, not me. So they're sitting here waiting for his attention after COVID. There's another box over there. And I've just received, last week, a very generous donation from Howard Brighton over in the States, who over years collected lots of old harp strings that he removed from instruments. And so those have been donated very, very kindly to the research collection. So they will hopefully get processed and understood a bit better. So come back to us in a year and we might be able to tell you something more about wound strings. Right. Is anyone making silk wound strings now? I think that Salopian, are they still going? I think that Salopian were making silk wound strings. They're very good strings. I've got them on a single action harp here. Did I make that little harp? Hazel, none of the harps that you can see here were made by me. There's a Briggs, a Sanderson Taylor, and the little one behind is a Grosjean, as I said. And the single action Erax, this little child's one, is here. There's also a very, very tiny Briggs on the other side of the room that I can't get to right now, a lap harp. Have you ever made one like that? I would love to have a go at making a little baby harp like that. I have made some small harps, but, well, we can talk about that. I can probably find you a drawing or something if you want to have a go. Now, right, let's see. So there's a Hobart harp. Now that name does come up. So yeah, Hazel, the clay is very like a very fine abrasive. That's a very good word for it. I still can't remember what it's called. Give me just a second, and I will find out for you. Trouble with such a chunky book is that finding Tripoli, that's the word. It's a sort of crushed clay type earth. It says here, so the Holtzford say in one of their books, the Tripoli used by the Messrs. Erax, from whom these particulars were gathered, was obtained from the earth removed in digging the canal in the Regent's Park, London. The dry lumps, when cleared from the clay by which they are surrounded, are of light brown yellow, as hard as stone, so as to require to be crushed with a hammer previous to it being ground. So it's actually not clay, I'm slightly wrong there. It's a sort of incursion within the clay, a sort of probably sandstone or chalk or something like that, I don't know. Right, single action mechanism, estimate around... All right. Gary, I'm not sure, are you talking about the Hobart? Hobart does appear in the Morley ledgers being restored, though it doesn't. Morley doesn't give us a great deal of information about that. He just records it, and if there's a serial number, he'll record the serial number. At some point, getting back to things that I need to do, I will have to create a digital archive of the Morley ledgers or a spreadsheet or something like that. But it's a very big job because there are so many volumes. Am I sure that I can't get to the other harp to show you? Let me go see if I can get over there. Hang on. All right. Now, this is a baby Briggs. It's a very lovely baby Briggs. It's signed by Briggs and has a serial number 70 on it. The Briggs behind me here is 1831. It's one of the first ones, 1931. Sorry, don't misquote me on that. 1931. It was made for the Clarsach Society. Briggs was a violin maker, but I just think that the instruments are so beautiful. I've done nothing with the strings on this one, though I have shimmed the soundboard. The soundboard was splitting, so I've done a little bit of work on that. Very much under the tutelage of Lewis Jones again, who's the expert in all things musical instrument. How do we spell Tripoli? You've spelt it correctly, Hazel. Does anybody have any further questions? How long have you been making harps? I made my first harp when I was 14 and I'm 46 now, but I haven't done a lot of making probably in the last 15 years. It's mostly been research. I had a great time working at Pilgrim, and I was working on the Progress 41 string double action for them. They're an absolutely remarkable group of people down there. If you haven't been to Pilgrim in Surrey, you need to go. Their pedal harps are remarkable. But no, I haven't made a harp in a very long time. Is the harp dated on page 6, Maria? I don't know. That particular harp, I think, came from an auction catalogue, and I got the information from the auction house. But I don't recall there being a date with it. It says here circa 1798 to 1801. Is that what you're talking about on page 6? Oh, the Cousineau. No, it's a V&A harp, and I don't think they have a date on it, the Cousineau on page 6, sorry. Anybody else have any questions or requests? I don't dance and I don't sing, and I definitely don't play the harp. I leave that to the experts like Maria. Right, well, I tell you what, if there's no more questions, I am just going to share the last bit of the PowerPoint with you. There is a discount code. There's a blind page on my website. Basically, you won't be able to find it by going to my website. I've hidden it. Hang on. Because I don't particularly want to get into selling my own stuff. But if you go to www.mike-baldwin.net/shop, you should then be able to get to the online shop page for my website. If you do want to buy a copy of the book, if you click through, you can pay on PayPal, either from a PayPal account or via card. And if you enter, without any spaces, Jacob Erat 20, as in 20, you will be able to get a 20% discount on the book for the next month. We'll see how that goes. If it's working well, we might let it run a lot longer. I don't know. We'll see. So I think really it's just left now to thank you all very much for your time. It's always lovely when people are interested, and when you're working on things like this, you just don't know. And just because I find it interesting doesn't mean everybody else does. There are many people that I really need to thank, because without them the book would not have been possible. Foremost amongst those is Lewis Jones, who has been the stalwart of musical instrument making at London Metropolitan University, formerly London Guildhall University, prior to that City Poly, prior to that the London College of Furniture. And although musical instrument making isn't happening there anymore, I suspect that over the last 40 years he has been responsible for many of the organologists and musical instrument makers that have come out in the UK. So, I think he deserves a huge round of applause for all of the support he's given me in researching, writing, learning how to do what I've done in order to make this book happen. I also really have to thank Dave Gray, who was my high school music teacher, who decided it wasn't something he was going to laugh at when I said I was going to make a harp. Instead, he introduced me to his father-in-law, Gordon Davey, an artist who also made harps. So from the age of 14, I spent my Saturdays working on harps out in Beaconsfield, outside London. The people to thank are too numerous. Maria obviously for her wonderful playing today. Mike Parker, who over the years has been the most wonderful sounding board, and very genuine and sharing his ideas and supporting lots of people who work in the field of particularly early pedal harps. I think that probably is all that I need to say today. You are very welcome to email me. I will get to questions as and when I can. I'm just going to refresh just to make sure I haven't missed anybody before we go. Oh God, there's quite a few. Excuse me, just a moment. Right. The name of the gunsmith turned harp maker. Nancy, I have a son who's a gunsmith and still have great hopes for him. Well, there's always hope. There's always hope. Catherine has said, were harps purchased mostly by individual orchestras, or was the harp considered more of an instrument for females? Well, generally, there's more fine detail on this in the book, but it was mostly an amateur instrument. Not to say that some of the amateurs weren't highly accomplished. It was predominantly female, though many of the most successful performers were male. It really wasn't bought by orchestras, I suppose, until the 20th century. It was a personal instrument owned by the instrument. And often when you look at I did a breakdown of this, and I can't remember whether I put it in the book or not. I think that about 40% of the Erax harps were bought by women, 60% by men, but many were bought on behalf of wives, daughters, that sort of thing. And I think Jenny Nex, in her PhD thesis, also did some similar analysis of the Erard ledgers to work out the proportion of male to female, titled to untitled people who bought their harps. So definitely go and find Jenny Nex, N-E-X, go and find her PhD thesis. Right, let's got some more here. Please show the Jean-Louis harp. I have done that. Nancy, I think you probably saw that, but if not, we can talk later and I'll show you again. Grosjean. Were Grosjean records... Can you tell me whether or not Grosjean records were ever found? This is Pat Marshall. Not yet. We live in hope. I can remember being told many, many years ago by a well-known harp retailer that there were no things. It was only the Erards. And lo and behold, there's a huge amount more. I've looked everywhere that I can in public collections, but I can't be exhausted. And there might well be. If you find them, do let me know. I'd love to see them. And I know that there were some Harnack registers at one point, and Moira Bonington, who's a descendant of the Harnacks, was very busily looking for those, and I don't think she ever found them. Are there visible signs left in London streets of the harp makers' buildings' street names? Jerry, and he can confirm that Dizzy Harps are a painter string. Most of the buildings are gone. I'm trying to think if there's any left. London was very badly damaged, obviously, during the Second World War, and buildings were demolished. And as London has developed, the want has been to go up, so they've often taken down the older buildings. I can't think of any surviving London makers' buildings. There's 14 Soho Square, where Schweitzer was very briefly. 14 Soho Square is more or less intact, though it's had a new attic roof put on. Interestingly, it was also later the home of Mary Seacole, the black Crimean nurse. Obviously not contemporary to Schweitzer, but definitely there. Thank you, Charles. Charles has ordered the book. Nancy said gunsmith. Oh, hang on. That's in German. I'll need to translate that. I don't speak German, Nancy, sorry. And I think that is everyone. Maria, I'll have an ask around about the silk wound strings. There's got to be someone who is doing it. I'm sure there is, but I don't know of them if it's not Salopian, I'm afraid. Right. Thank you so much for all of your time. I do hope that I've answered all the questions. I hope I haven't missed anyone, but if I have, email me and I'll see if I can help. I hope you enjoy the book. I'm going to go and have a glass of wine and hopefully speak to many of you soon. Beautiful Harp by Lejean Lee. It's described with exercises on the Nouvelle Method. I think not the first edition. Maria, yes. Thank you. Have a wonderful remainder of the weekend wherever in the world you are. Keep well, keep away from COVID. We don't want all that rubbish. And hopefully we'll see you at the next book launch in probably another 10 years' time. Take care. Bye-bye.